Our blessed game plan, their broken tactics.
Next on Eternal Dirtals.
Stop! I need more stuff. Can you see I need more stuff? But I will go.
Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. If you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurtles. In return, you'll get ad-free content and a bonus episode every single week. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Eternal Dirtals. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, as a Miracles bro, the only tactics I have are blessed.
The only tactics are blessed. Yeah, so this is a departure from our normal content where we're doing something where I'm not just antagonizing Phil about how Miracles is bad, because that episode already took off this week. So I feel like we can only do so many episodes where we talk about how Phil's deck is not good and is a dead part of the format. So with that said, first off, thanks everybody for chiming in, typing below, commenting, all that stuff. That was awesome. That was a much bigger episode than I thought it would be. That really resonated with a lot of people. The concept of control being a dead archetype in the format. And there were arguments on both sides of that. Some people think, there's the different kinds of control and whatnot. But it was a fun episode, and I really appreciate that. It really resonated with everybody. Eternal Dirtals is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel. So with that said, another topic Phil and I had been discussing for a while was this concept of and shout out to Zahar who sent me that meme, which I'll throw up eventually to talk about the meme that this comes from. But the concept of what is and is not BS, and how players react to things that ostensibly are doing the same thing, but they feel are this particular tactic is annoying, but this is fine. A perfect example is I hate Blood Moon. I can't stand it. I just do not want to be Blood Moon. It's the one thing that if you screw up my lands, my mana bases, why am I even here, right? Phil doesn't like days. So what I want to do is sort of delve into these different tactics that are broadly accepted by most of the players in the format, and then talk about things that aren't. So a classic example of things that over time became not acceptable, the Grief Reanimate combo, right? Grief Reanimate Grief, right? Was their broken tactics, to coin the term, right? As opposed to something Reanimate Grizzlebrand, just fine. Reanimate Atraxa seems like most people are on board with that being a quote unquote fair thing to do. In and of those two cards, I don't think the whole deck is necessarily fair, but reanimating a fatty, putting it onto the board, people are okay with that. But reanimating a card that screws with your opponent's hand over and over again, they're not exactly on board with that.
Yeah, baked into this, which we'll have to figure out how to navigate, is how much of that sort of thing is baked into sort of just the culture of the game as it existed before we started having these sort of conversations at large.
Yeah.
Reanimate Grizzlebrand was never good. It was never a reasonable thing to accept. But everybody accepted it as something that it's just a thing that is available. But nobody ever had fun doing it, nor ever did anybody have fun losing to it. It made a wash of just bad game experience for all involved. Yeah. And so the our blessed gameplay, your barbaric tactics are how much are we as a community willing to accept and or tolerate the stuff that is just heinous at all costs, both the players playing with and against, just never have any fun with it. And at what threshold are we willing to accept that as part of our experience? Because when Zach is the one who came up with the idea of discussing this sort of ideology around certain play patterns, and the thing that came up from the last episode, where we were talking about what the control decks might need and what have you, is how the gameplay of Sensei's Top plus Counterbalance and the game not actually ending, but it theoretically being over once you're effectively locked, or the way that Nadu does now, where it's okay, they flip over a bunch of cards, and even though you're not deterministically dead, you're pretty much dead and should probably just concede for the sake of quality of life. That within that then is, okay, at what threshold is something that we all don't want to have as part of our experience playing our hobby. At what point do we go, hey, now is the moment where this isn't too powerful for legacy standards. It's not too egregious for things by comparison. I'll take a asterisk on the by comparison because there is something that I would like to talk about on that. But at what percent, we'll get into it. One of the topics today is going to be Dread Return as just a card because Oops All Spells is starting to pick up in the metagame. What does that look like? At what percentage are we willing to accept that with all the MDFCs coming in, that Oops is an acceptable thing to just have as part of our game because it is just going to be ubiquitously unfun for a tournament if it's at a certain threshold. So what is that threshold? One thing to discuss, though, is for anybody who gets in the comments, please get in the comments. We're happy to spar.
We're in there. We're always in the comments.
I would like to silence the classic go-to argument for something, which is, oh, but show and tell exists. So like you can't. This thing's fine. It's like if show and tell can exist, then you can't have this. Show and tell requires 3 mana plus another combo piece, plus your entire deck built around doing that, and then there's a fail rate baked into it.
Yeah.
Like the consistency and power level is just not there because you need both 3 mana plus the thing. Like there's so many levels. It is the most overused thing, and we should just choose to dunk on the people who now use it as a defense, as a straw man tactic to divert from the conversation.
Well, one thing I want to do before we get too deep into this is I think a really great and at the risk of leaving this particular episode and going and checking out somebody else's content, Matt Chow had a really great episode today, sort of discussing like is Legacy a wasteland and talking about just like do we rely too much on the math, do we rely too much on the feels, and a lot of his opinions is really well thought out, and you probably saw it written out on Reddit. Really well thought out piece of content that I think everyone would improve their lives by checking out. So friend of the show, Matt Chow, somewhere up here I've probably linked to it. So I just wanted to mention that before we get into the bulk of the episode. But yeah, so with that, like our Blessed Tempo deck, their Barbarous aggro deck, right? Like that's the thing. But really, we're talking about like what we do versus what our opponents do, right? Like, and when we don't like what our opponents do, but we don't mind what we do. Like I have been the guy who's played Stasis. I have been the guy who's played Blood Moon in his Storm deck, So I understand where those things are acceptable at certain points. But I think one of the like you had just said, one of the things that people are really talking about right now is Nadu. Hey, Nadu makes the game miserable. It goes to time, that sort of thing, which I vehemently disagree with. I think the people who are losing to Nadu that are going to time are just not scooping in time. Like if anything, it behooves your opponent to continue going through shenanigans, while you sit there and you fry your brain about being mad about him doing whatever, without you deciding to scoop because he's just going to get that first win and then waste the rest of the time. Like they're probably not even doing it on purpose, but like it behooves them to just like waste the rest of the time on the clock. If you're not going to scoop, like of course you're going to go, okay, I'm going to get infinite tokens. I'm going to get infinite guys. They're going to be infinitely large. Oh, okay, you get to go. If you're allowing your opponent to do that and your answer is, I have Supreme Verdict, Supreme Verdict doesn't even stop that from happening again. It just like it sets the clock back for like half a turn and then you pass and he's like, okay, Nadu core and does the whole thing over again. And then what are you drawing a second Supreme Verdict and then having it all happen again? Like they can cycle their deck infinite times. That I say all that to say this, I can understand how that could be a miserable experience for some people. And it is not a prevailing, but it is a growing in popularity stance that particular deck, not all the Nadu decks, but that particular Nadu deck is a miserable experience because it this is the argument a lot of people use is like it goes to time, it makes every round go long. Look, every round with a tournament of over 100 people goes 45 minutes over time every single time. I've never seen a tournament that didn't do that. Don't use the last Eternal Weekend. The time was whatever. Like unless you have the data to back that up for like the last 3 Eternal Weekends, I don't want to hear that argument because it's nonsense. If you have over 200 people in a tournament, it's going to go 45 minutes over every round in the very beginning of the tournament.
And the actual solution to that is to just obsolete 5 additional turns that are untimed.
Thank you.
You just obsolete it. It goes to time, whatever draw, and then if somebody wants to concede, they can. But like the conversation happens right there, not during 5 additional turns, because then people can take more time. That's a whole different conversation. But the solution is just obsolete 5 additional turns.
Yeah. I mean, that's not going to happen either. But to that end,
it could. It doesn't. But like, there's no reason to say that why it wouldn't.
Sure.
Also, have I frozen? Am I frozen?
You are frozen right now, but that's okay. We can keep going. You're probably not frozen because the podcasting we use does it latently. So people will hear you saying you're frozen, but you won't be frozen. But you were frozen for me for a second.
That was my ice cold take.
Ice cold take. But yeah, I think what are the factors, Phil? You think that broadly. Do you think people decide that like this isn't fun for me? I want it out of the format. What do you think those factors are?
So it's really odd because I feel like I am in the like pretty stark minority in that like I think that a lot of people don't like when there isn't any agency or relatively consistent enough counterplay to something that otherwise makes it so that there isn't a reason for you to be there. So like the great example that everybody sort of got behind was, Grief plus Reanimate Grief as a play pattern was just like, okay, we both effectively mind twist ourselves down to nothing on turn 0, except you have a clock and I don't, and then we're already top decking, and there's just really no reason for either of us to be sitting there anymore. Like, why did we do this? And I find that play pattern of it is unfun is then, if you were to broaden that, like that's just a very, very clear, concise example of like a play pattern that had no counterplay to it at all. And it was boring and nobody ever enjoyed it and it sucked and it was powerful. Yeah. I think that like, if you were to zoom out and go like what that looks like, there are so many more people right now that are heated on Nadu than they are heated on Oops All Spells or heated on Entomb Reanimate plus Fatty that effectively ends the game. And there is some amount of counterplay of like, okay, yeah, there's Graveyard Hate or whatever, but the agency within that counterplay is just opening your 7 and hoping it's good. I am of the mind that I think it is, I would give the pass to the decks that even though the game effectively ends, it does take some amount of interaction and gameplay for a couple of turns. Like if you can get to at least, I don't know, 2 turns seems to be like is a reasonable thing where you can, I don't know, take a turn cycle and take a game action as a reasonable thing, where a decision beyond just do I keep my 7 or mulligan again, I imagine that for me, I don't like when I sit down, mulligan or don't, and that was the only agency that I had at all for the entirety of the game. Like, because then I go, well, why am I here? Why don't I just do literally anything else rather than play this game that I'm not actually getting to play?
Yeah.
And so
that's interesting. So, I was thinking about specific tactics that people take or gameplay experiences, but you're talking about decks that just can that basically leverage it so that both players have to evaluate in the blind what their hand is and say, okay, do you have the thing to stop my deck? Otherwise I win.
Oh yeah. So I got a little bit more specific down into the weeds for a bit, but yeah, I think that like I don't know what it is, and what I would like to like assess and get the community's thoughts on is what is the threshold of those things. Like we ended up like there were some people who were calling for Reanimate as a ban in the last ban announcement, even though it was Frog and Vexing Bauble. And Vexing Bauble, to an extent, is a stripping of that agency, right? Like when a Vexing Bauble comes down, it just blanks a bunch of cardboard that would otherwise extend the game for the deck that doesn't care about the opponent being there. Right. So in ways we banned the card that effectively promoted the deck that didn't give a shit about the opponent being there. And when I think it is reasonable to take the first attack on those types of strategies, like those are not the strategies that we should be trying to protect, which, in part goes why I think that there was reasonable argument in the last ban to like have the discussion around Reanimate if you're not going to obsolete a bunch of the fatties that otherwise effectively end the game when Reanimate would recur something. So if the fatties are off the table because there's just too many of them and it becomes a vintage restricted problem, then Reanimate becomes the interesting thing because Reanimate is the only thing that does what it does within the turn cycle that it can do it in. Everything else is 2 mana or more. And so the argument for that as the Reanimate doesn't care if your opponent's there, right? Like Frog, in a way, does. It needs the player to attack, and therefore it has to care about removal, and it has to care about blockers potentially if they don't have flying. Like there is we have to engage somehow as a card, which then makes me go, maybe that's not the thing that we should be punishing. Now, the whole Days Wasteland thing as a metric, recalibrated a bunch of that and has forever, and in those types of decisions. But I think that when we think like our blessed strategy, their barbaric tactics, I see barbaric tactics as definitionally the decks or strategies or play patterns that don't care if your opponent is there or not. You could just goldfish it, and it would be the same experience as to whether or not your
their
opponent
linear strategy, their mindless burn, their annoying cards.
It's like, if it is irrelevant if the opponent is there, then okay, then it is not needed for a game. That's solitaire, and I think we should actively take stances against that type of shit.
Well, I think it's interesting because there are data points that support what you're saying. Because look at Ragavan as a perfect example of you're basically put you in the same scenario, right? Where like you had to, and it worked the format around that one card. People were playing Gutshot and stuff, but like the idea was like in the blind, if your opponent like had turn one Ragavan with Days back up, like a lot of what you do doesn't even matter after that. Like you have to find a way to stop that from happening, and they banned the card for that reason, right? But then I think then there's stuff like I know you're gonna roast me for this, but top and counterbalance. Now I'm not gonna.
We'll get into that because I disagree with it.
No,
but I disagree with it for a reason.
Here's the thing: here's why I can agree with the top and counterbalance, and it's not because it's taking too much time. That's just bad. That means that the people playing the deck is good, and the people that are playing that deck are bad at playing the deck. That is how I've always approached the time thing. It's like, great, there's a bunch of people that don't know how to play this deck properly, and yes, that is overall bad for the tournament that you're in. But they're gonna find out really fast that when they go 0-5, like that's not a viable deck for them to play, and they'll switch off of that deck, or they'll keep playing it and lose. And you'll eventually get to a point where those people sink to the bottom, right? But yeah, does it make that particular, especially when you only have 3 to 5 tournaments a year that actually mean something? That can make the format a miserable experience. I thought that combo was one of those, their barbarous tactics, because it basically said, look, if you don't diversify your mana cost, like you're gonna get punished. And some decks were great at that, but some decks, they weren't printing cards that were diversified versions of cards. Like Blue Red Delver was fine. It had Pyromancer. It could Pyromancer and like cast a bunch of 1-drops that got countered but still got the tokens, right? But if you're playing Teamer Delver, everything is 1 mana at most, 2 mana.
And so I would. This is where, if like on the argument of our blessed strategy, their barbaric tactics, I actually think counterbalance, and not just because I'm a truther for it, but I actually think for how we're describing things, or at least for my definition of the barbaric tactics are the stuff that don't care about your opponent and otherwise make games increasingly unfun and uninteractive. Is Countertop is in the other camp to me because it inherently
you could play through.
Hold on. Let me get through it.
Go on.
It inherently needs the opponent because not only does the fact that Delver and the strategies are built on 1-drops and nothing else because they can't play anything over 3 because Daze is in their deck, right? The Countertop was good against them. But Countertop by itself can never actually win the game.
No.
Right?
Well,
so if it's assembled, now it can have inevitability until you get to a point where you win the game, but it never actually by itself is effectively winning the game. Now
this is a point I wanted to make. Go on, continue, but I'm going to write this down.
I'm not done yet.
Yeah, go on.
The other thing about it, and why it's a blessed tactic as opposed to their barbaric whatevers, is if you wanted to diversify your CMC to get around a counterbalance, you could. If you wanted to play tools that could beat a counterbalance, you could. Do you know why? There was time in order for you to implement those changes of strategy. You were actually able to adjust and adapt and have time to execute that game plan. There was an opportunity for you to solve a problem. against the stuff like if there was a vexing bauble that then was followed by whatever, you don't have time to solve the problem. Grief coming in, you don't have time to solve the problem. If a threat is fast and powerful enough that's backed by days on the play, you don't have enough time to solve that problem. Like if you're playing against Eldrazi that they just that play Cavern of Souls plus whatever, and then you're so far behind because their mana is so much faster than yours, and they have their deck in their hand at all times, you don't have an opportunity to solve that problem. Like against Counterbalance slowed the format down, but you always had the opportunity, if you wanted to go in and solve the problem. It wasn't a barbaric tactic.
Phil, at the risk of turning this into the do or don't unban Sensei Divining Top show, I think the important thing, the real reason why, and this is the unspoken reason why Counterbalance and Top got banned, is because it doesn't win the game. Because the game doesn't end after the thing happens. This is why I also don't like Blood Moon. It's like the game doesn't immediately end. I have to wait for the game to end. Give me 1 second, because I'm going to follow this up with a perfect example of a card that could win the game, but made the game longer specifically. And this was in Standard. Emrakul, the Promised End. This is a card that it's like a 13/13 flyer or something, protection from opponent's instance, or I don't know. It has a bunch of attacks, but what it did was allow you to take over your opponent's next turn. So, and then they got to play your next turn too. But basically, during Standard, when this card existed, you would slam this card, look at all the cards in your opponent's hand, and be like, "Cool, great, I get to do what you're doing. I'm going to kill off all of your stuff with your cards, right?" And then the chance that your opponent was going to win after that was super slim. It was super tiny, and this is where we're going, and this is the point I'm making with Nadu and Core Nomad. The chances that your opponent's going to win are super slim, but people kept trying to play it out, and this is what killed Emrakul in that particular Standard. They were like, we gotta get rid of this card because I think it was like Marvel, Aetherflux Marvel or something like that. They got the card out. But specifically, they were like, we have to kill this strategy because people are staying in the game for way too long, and it's just a bad experience all around. Now,
Zach, what is the difference between what Counterbalance did to a game, and like you're in the Teamer Delver slot, as you just argued, and playing against a Counterbalance meant that like it was bad, and you were locked or whatever, and you're choosing not to concede in that spot where you know that you're locked and it's just going to be whatever.
It's
so,
anecdotal, but yes.
But what's the difference between what that would do versus what Chalice does?
Well, okay, so big point. I also hate Chalice. I play Chalice when I play Chalice when I'm playing 8-cast, but like a part of me dies inside when I win because I just put a Chalice on the board. And it's not like that anymore because there are so many answers to these cards now. And there's format,
so many answers to these cards now.
The format has diversified a lot. I do agree with you, Phil. I think that now if Sensei Divining Top became unbanned, the format wouldn't be any worse or better. And I also don't think that Miracles would get any better. I think that would be actually as bad.
I also want to clarify that the last couple of episodes we've been talking about Sensei's Top like a lot in earnest. And it's not because I'm trying to like enact getting Sensei's Top.
No, it's just a great example. It's a great example.
It's just a great foundational example as to what I think is psychosomatic, like something that we as collectively as a format, as a community, seem to gravitate toward when we talk about problems within the format. And I'm curious as to why it is, because I feel like I'm on the opposite side of it. Like everybody was like, oh, Counterbalance, it makes things go to time, or it makes things go long, or it's unfun to play against because I'm effectively locked. And I look at Chalice and see the same thing, but nobody is ever calling for Chalice as a problem because it's followed up and happens to be in decks that are like stompy shit. Right? So like, the game ends, but like, was it the stompy things that killed you, or was it because they killed you so you didn't have the choice to concede when you were effectively locked if they didn't do anything anyway?
Yeah.
And so,
this was the problem with Vexing Bauble as well.
This was the problem with Vexing Bauble, sure. Yeah, like Vexing Bauble, mind twisting your stuff so you couldn't interact. It's like, okay, yeah, I don't care if the opponent's across the table. Now, the thing with Chalice, though, is if I want to play answers in my deck to beat Chalice, I can. But if I increase the number of Brazen Borrowers or Prismatic Endings or whatever, I'll be better against Chalice. If I cut stuff against that, I'm actively taking a hit against it. I have options to be able to contend against the card, even though I think it is abysmal to play against.
Well,
right?
here's the thing, Phil.
But
Here's what I think one of their barbarous tactics are, right? Their broken tactics is cards that I'm not playing with. New cards that aren't the cards I'm playing with, right? I think that's a lot of the player mentality is I don't like this card because it invalidates my 2014, Teamer Delver deck, let's say, right? I think that is. I mean, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that is the mentality that you have to just live in that world. You have to understand that is a legitimate thing that people are feeling when they say, "Oh, like I don't like Vexing Bobble because I can't play Force of Will." So
that's evergreen. It's evergreen that your stuff of old has been power crept out. That's no longer the.
I mean, you don't have to explain that to me. I'm just saying that is the mentality that we have to fight when we're talking about their broken tactics. A lot of times that is I don't like the new cards.
I don't have to. I don't have. You and I agree on that, and you and I are talking into a void to each other here, so we can move on to the next thing. Which I think is the difference of what you're talking about is. There are things that are passive and there are things that are proactive. And the proactive stuff that doesn't give a shit about whether or not your opponent has crossed the table needs to be more acutely and aggressively dealt with than the stuff that is passive. Now, a Chalice of the Void can effectively win the game, but it never actually wins the game. A Countertop can effectively win the game, but never actually wins the game, right? Like in ways where it's like, if it comes down, you can't do things, and it blanks a certain amount of cardboard, but there's still ways to play around. Like you can still, like you were talking about with Young Pyromancer, like fire off your stuff into a Chalice, and that can be a strategy to play through a Chalice. So I will get that kind of recruitment. Like
I will mirror that with. Go on.
Well, I was going to say the reason that Vexing Bauble didn't have that kind of capacity is you could cycle it.
Yeah, I will mirror that with the Sensei's Divining Top situation. Where this was late into right before it got banned. I was at Grand Prix New York playing in a side event or something like that, and this was when I was like, the card that needs to get banned is Gurmag Angler because I can't keep up with that. Like Black just gets so many better things and this is when Teamer Delver just did not have a way to catch up to Gurmag Angler, right? So I'm in this tournament, and the only thing I'm worried about in this tournament was Miracles and Grixis. And of course I get paired up against a Grixis player, and at some point in time I get miracled, all my creatures go, my opponent's at 5 life, right? And I am sitting here with 2 bolts in my hand. He's got Counterbalance and Top in play, and I'm like, all I need to do is get this guy to spin Top, looking for a 1-drop, not find a 1-drop to counter like a Brainstorm or a Ponder, and I'm going to zap him twice, right? And I was able to do that, right? But that's the sort of thing that you figure out as a veteran of the format against, and I was eating players like that. Like people who were playing Miracles were not playing Miracles to the Phil Bleckman level of Miracles. I could bait them with do you want to counter my Brainstorm? It seems like not the smartest thing to do when you could hold back for knowing you're at double bolt range. Do you really want to set yourself up for he's got 4 cards in his hand? 2 of them could be lightning bolts. If you flip your top and put it back on top of your deck, I'm going to double bolt you. So those, I say all that to say this. People can play around those things. And I think that, in a situation where we're looking at going back to the point of the video, what are the things that most players don't like? What are the play patterns that most players hate, right? That end up getting cards banned. And I think one of them is getting locked out of the game. That's, the last 30 minutes or whatever has been talking about specific cards. But I think getting locked out of the game is one of those things people viscerally hate. And they'll use, time, they'll use, this deck has too good of a win percentage, blah, blah, blah. Delver, continually hit higher win percentages, and it would be Teamer Delver or Grixis Delver, but tempo overall would be 50+% of the meta, and that was acceptable. But once you get a deck that's not one of those decks that gets to that level in the meta, because there's only one flavor of it, people start to chatter, and that chatter becomes a rumble, and that rumble becomes a growl, and the growl becomes a ban.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that my thought process to your, I think that it's good and fine that Delver tempo, or as a the Delver, the Royal Delver, as a strategy, as a strategy is totally fine to have at the top of a metagame, because it is a deck that is
interactable.
It's interactive, but it's also just like, it's good on consistency, and then it is able to leverage speed and tempo, of course. But like, I also don't think that Delver has ever, like, I don't think Delver or anything and in Delver has ever been like a critical issue, unless it was a power creep problem as inherent to the card itself. Looking at Luris, looking at Renin 6 in a world where Wasteland exists. But like, for the other things, whether that's Dreadheart Arcanist or Psychic Frog or what have you, where there are different things, but like things that are 2-drops that don't do anything when they immediately touch the board, right? I mean, I think that the problem with all of those cards that are on the ban list are those cards are at a power level where they are too good with days, so that if you have it
for
on
the sins
play,
of days,
well, it's for the sins of days, but like the idea of the not caring what my opponent is across the table, when there is a threat so powerful that if you know that it is protected guaranteed on the play, then it doesn't matter what your opponent does if you have days. You just daze it, because whatever you getting with the powerful thing that you just protected on your turn will be so overwhelming that it doesn't matter who is there anymore.
Yeah.
So like, to a lesser degree than the other cards that we've been talking about, but still to an effective and high enough volume of a degree where you run into it often enough that it becomes an unenjoyable experience. Like, the idea of Ragavan on the play, go, backed by days, meant that the only actual way to contend with it is actual factual gut shot.
It's gut shot,
because you would need to play your land plus a free removal spell. So it's either that or it's snuff out, right?
Or it's bolt with your own days back up to daze their days, which is like, come on.
And of course, right? Yeah, that's self-explanatory. But like, in those situations, it's like, well, you can't free counter magic that because days exists. And then if you're doing anything that is going over the top of whatever that is, like, oh, it doesn't matter if they daze me because if I can go over the top, like my deck is so powerful, it doesn't matter. Those types of decks don't care about what is across the table.
All right. So we have two specific genres of their broken tactics.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So we've got prison, like being locked out of the game, being able to make, what
I want to
again. This is a mob mentality thing, Phil. It's not. I'm not saying that it's ostensibly, divining top.
I'm not coming to that defense. I really want for us and everybody listening, even though I am a fan of Countertop, that I don't talk about it in a way where I'm like, I am a victim and this is a victim.
Yeah. We're over it getting unbanned. It's not going to happen.
When it comes to prison strategies, prison is fine. I think that prison is a problem when it doesn't have to care about anything that's ever across the table, because the thing that it does is, in a vacuum, always the most powerful and ostensibly broken thing. And
but Phil, the way we feel about prison is irrelevant. What I'm saying is their barbarous tactics. Prison is one of those. I'm
arguing that it doesn't. When you say it doesn't matter how we feel about it, I am proposing that we have a more nuanced and defined,
of course,
how we look at it.
Yeah.
Which is, if a card is prison and it's unfun, it is unfun because there is no way to play against it, because it doesn't matter, because it is objectively always going to be the most powerful thing, and it's always going to be solitaire. There is no way to go to compete against it. If somebody plays something like Grief plus Reanimate as a strategy that is too powerful with no counterplay, it doesn't matter if there is an opponent. That is, it is the nuance of when we're talking about, okay, is Nadu too good? Should it be the next thing that we talk about? I'm over here thinking, well, there's ways that you can compete. Like, Nadu is extremely powerful, but like, you have turns and points of interaction where you can disrupt and interact with it. Like, a lot of times they don't need to care what's across the table, but like, you can pivot and maneuver based on like where a metagame is going to go. Are the different Nadu decks leaning? Do you think you're going to run into a particular variation of Nadu, and where Curse Totem is going to be more powerful, or is like more removal going to be more powerful, or like do I have to make sure that I fight over the thing before a Cavern of Souls comes into play because that card's horseshit. Like as opposed to something like, okay, there are enough MDFCs now where Oops just is so consistent at turn oneing, and it's now encroaching over 5% of the metagame at large, and that is a problem. Look,
Well, that's my other point.
But I'm not saying that those things aren't both problems. They can all be problems.
Oh yeah.
I'm saying the prioritization of what we need to do to solve those problems, if we're not going to take the big swings like they did in Modern, where we overhaul a bunch of shit all at once, then what is the priority of which things that we handle? And I'm saying that if the barbaric tactics are the things that we should prioritize, that's it.
Yeah, well, so okay, two things here. Let me finish my listing the barbaric tactics.
You, Zach.
No, Matt Chow's video that I was talking about before, he did a really good job of like lining out, like, you know, they should take those big swings. He made so many great points in that video, and I sort of lost the plot of what I was about to say because I was trying to get my point in. But watch it, 100% watch it. But so prison is one. We're like overbalancing your keeps, I think, is another, right? Like that's the Oops All Spells problem. Exacerbating the play draw, I think, is another one that is different. That is different than like determining keeps in the blind. I think determining keeps in the blind is like leveraging that as a tactic is a barbarous tactic, right? Leveraging play draw, a barbarous tactic, right? And then like locking your opponent out of the game early is a barbarous tactic. I think that if Soul Lands didn't exist, I wouldn't feel as viscerally. And I'm not calling for the ban of Blood Moon. Like that's not where I'm at. I think that if Soul Lands didn't exist, I would not feel as viscerally about people playing Blood Moon. If somebody was like Simian Spirit Guide, Mountain, Blood Moon, I'd be like, yeah, I mean, you just used 4 cards and you got me. I didn't have a daze or anything. That is life, you know. But it's the idea that like you're filling your deck with, you know, like 8 cards that produce 2 mana, 4 cards that produce another 8 cards that produce 1 mana for free, and then Magus of the Moon and Blood Moon. That's 8. You've got 8, 8, 8. So it's pretty, I don't know what the math is on that, but it's pretty easy to combine, like 1 of 8, 1 of 8, 1 of 8 into an opener and be like, yeah, I got it. Do you have an answer for this or do you just lose the game? And that's where I think like that particular situation for me, this is a personal feeling, not this should be banned feeling, is that tactic feels barbarous. It feels unfair. I don't like it.
And
it's valid. I just don't like it.
It's agreed. Like there are cards that are unfun because they don't let you play the game. I assume the position that the cards that are unfun and like because they don't let you play also mean that like they're cards that don't let you play and also don't offer you any agency before you go to an event. So when you went down, whatever deck you brought, there was no strategy available to you that was going to be able to combat Grief plus Reanimate, right? Like if that package is just in the format and they haven't printed any of the tools to be able to fight over that, then there is nothing that you can do before the event. You do not have any agency before the event, so it doesn't matter if you're there. Now, for something like Blood Moon, it's like, well, if I think the room is going to be a lot of Blood Moon, or I really don't want to lose to Blood Moon, there are tools that I can play. Either I can play more basics, I can play a bunch of green cards plus Force of Vigor, I can play Lorien Reveal to cycle from my island plus Hydroblast. Like, there are things that you can preemptively, before you get to a tournament, go, I'm going to not lose to this thing as best as to my ability. Now, a card that doesn't, which is in the same space, is something like Sowing Mycospawn, which is why I would go in this thing where they both disrupt your mana, right? They both go after your mana. But I would say Sowing Mycospawn is the thing that should be prioritized as a problem that we would need to remove before the other one, because you can't bring non-basics or basics. It doesn't matter. Sowing Mycospawn doesn't give a shit, right? So you can't actually play around that.
Phil, you missed one point when you were talking about the like how you prepare against a particular like Blood Moon or whatever.
Go for it. Yeah.
You can just accept that you're going to lose to that deck too.
Right.
Like that is an option. You could be like, I hope I don't run into that.
But I think inherently in choosing to lose to something, it means that you're choosing not to put in the tools to potentially beat it.
Agreed.
That's different. You have agency to choose to lose to it.
I just want to make sure that is an option statement.
But I'm saying that like if you were, there was no like when Grief was around as the easy example here for the point of the conversation. When Grief was around, there wasn't anything where you're like, oh, well, I'm going to choose to not play the tools because I just hope to dodge, and therefore I will choose to lose to it. No. You didn't have an option. If you choose to lose to Blood Moon, well, you can always go and say, well, I had agency before the tournament, knowing that like I called the metagame wrong. Had I called the metagame right, had I studied, figured out where it was going to be, there were the tools available to me to compete against that. Which I go, okay, the Blood Moon to a degree. Still, the Blood Moon player, even if they're going, I think the metagame at large is susceptible to this, and therefore I'm going to try to exploit that. And then the people who are not trying to exploit that on that access can go, I'm going to choose the tool to play the tools that don't get fucking wrecked by that, right? Like we have the opponent matters in those scenarios because the tools exist to be able to fight over that. Whereas there are a bunch of strategies where if they don't, right, and that's where like right now I think like the easiest example is before, like there's a certain threshold of at what point did Grief plus Reanimate need to hit as a recurring unreplayable experience that we didn't want to have anymore, that it goes, we need to call this. Now, Pete Vanderham just released this thing that when Grief was banned, it was just under 23% of the format, right? Okay, so it exceeded 20%. Now, my question to everybody listening is, at what is we as a legacy community talking to the people, like voicing our opinions to the people at WotC, what is the threshold of the format that we are going, this experience is unfun, does not have enough counterplay at a consistent enough rate to it, and we have no agency to fight it? At what point, what is the percentage that we should say we should be calling for bans here because we collectively agree that it has reached this percentage, which is way too much? Now, that can be on a case-by-case basis, but I would argue right now, like as example, I think the modal double-face cards, making it so that Oops All Spells is consistent enough to be 5% of the field. Like, I get it. 5% of the field, you may not run into it at all. But like, at the same time, do you, like, in order to beat that, like, that is a thing where you don't even have really the option. It's like, if you want to beat that deck so heavily in your sideboard, because the amount of time that you have to actually implement that game action against it is so narrow, it is literally your mulligan, that you have to over-index your entire sideboard to be able to beat it. Which means that the objectively correct thing to do is ignore it. And then as more people ignore it, because that is the correct thing to do mathematically, that more and more Oops players can be like, well, if everybody's going to keep ignoring, then we're going to continue playing it. More players start playing Oops until it's respected, at which case that format sucks.
Yeah.
So that is an unfun format. So what is the percentage? What is the threshold where we start respecting something and then going, fuck this, I don't want to play anymore?
I'm glad you brought it back to that, because if you see me writing, I'm trying to, I have something important to say, right? And that was a great point, and I think that was what I was trying to talk about with the Matt Chow, the last Matt Chow call out, was that one of the things he talks about is WotC just needs to like have a philosophy for this format beyond like what the rules of the format are. Like, they need to do that. They sit down and say, hey, what is the philosophy of Legacy? And actually ask players too. Don't just be like, we're just going to make it up because we don't play it enough. We just came with off the cuff what we think it is. Literally talk to your players and determine what the actual philosophy, what you want the philosophy to be, what the players want the philosophy to be for this format.
I can actually get a little bit specific on that, I think. Because we joke about it a lot, but Forsyth, I mean, I don't know if times would have changed between now and then, but between the last ban announcement where they didn't ban Nadu because they say Legacy can handle a lot of power, in which case they then banned Vexing Bubble and all that, and says it can hold a lot of power, and they called they specifically called like Force of Will the glue of the format. Okay, if that's a stance that we're taking, but then we've heard from Forsyth, where they say transgressive cards need a place to live. Now, transgressive cards needing a place to live sounds like a fine philosophy if this is a format where transgressive cards live. Now, I think the thing that needs to be defined is what is transgressive and what is broken.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And if we can figure
our
out what that line is,
transgressive tempo deck, their broken strategy,
broken,
right?
yeah.
Like, yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like, I think if you can delineate, if you're like, this is what we define transgressive to mean as
Yeah.
the perimeter of what the
I love
format
that.
is willing to tolerate, then so rather than saying we need a philosophy for the format, which can be ever changing and subjective, I think if you just define what transgressive means, which I would argue at a baseline needs to be, if a strategy or card does not care about your opponent being there or not in any capacity before the event or during the event, that is broken and not transgressive. Like now that can obviously evolve and adapt and to whatever the liking of whatever WotC feels and whatever we would communicate to WotC. But I think defining that would be an actual route to figuring out what the format, or like, because the format of the Legacy's identity, I think you can say, is transgressive cards need a place to live. It's the place where
Sure,
it's
that's a format identity,
but
but it's not a philosophy.
But then if you define transgressive, then you can, right?
Yeah.
So like if we were to summarize this as, hey everyone, how should we define transgressive? You've heard part of what I think should be in it. What should we add?
Okay, here's cleanup step here. One, check out eternaldirtals.com. We've got a new article up there by Eric Kowski, friend of the show, obviously friend of the show if he's writing on the site about Pauper.
Yep.
Amazing. Two, what comment below? What is the difference between transgressive and broken? What are the barbarous tactics that you and these are tactics, not specific cards. What are the barbarous tactics that you cannot stand in this format that you think need to go? What are the things that get you?
Also, putting it out there that now that we have eternaldirtals.com where written content can exist,
yeah.
If you actually have a strong enough opinion and a comment is not the place to put it out, DM me. We will give you the platform to speak about your personal opinion about what it should be.
And it can be, it doesn't have to be agreeing with us here,
It can agree, it can disagree, it can have nuance. And if we get, a dozen people that all want to do it, then I'll make it a series. Let's talk about it. Because the more and more that we get around to it, the more and more we're going to have like these positions where they make a ban, like Psychic Frog and Vexing Bauble. Nothing happens except the format getting what I think is objectively still bad. And then we go, okay, where do we go from here? And then every time we have the conversation of we feel like we're 5 ban announcements behind or whatever. And it's because there's no target.
If you are writing a comment that you think I'm going to look at and go, thank you, congratulations, or I'm sorry, I'm not going to read all that, it belongs on eternaldirtals.com.
Essentially, if your comment is long enough that some people would be like, if you need a TLDR for your comment, just DM me. I'll put it on eternaldirtals.com.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that said, I want to quickly thank all of our Patreon supporters. You guys are doing God's work over here. We're able to get some new iconography for the site because of that. We've got some travel dates coming up for some new events. Got a couple events coming up as well that we're gonna cover. And with that said, thank you everybody for watching, and we will catch you on the next one. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the Legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldirtles. Thanks so much for watching.